psychobiology is divided into two fields. It's an academic subject, and there are two parts to it. One is psychophysiology, which is looking at the physical and functional mechanisms which give rise to the way that we think and feel. So we have a brain, the different parts of the brain serve different sorts of functions. The other sort of psychobiology, the other category of psychobiology, is called evolutionary psychology. And this looks at the sorts of evolutionary features that gave rise to the sorts of structures, the sorts of ways of thinking and being that we as human beings tend to share as a whole species. So, for example, if we talk about the fact that people every day pretty much get hungry, being hungry was useful in terms of motivating human beings and our predecessors to forage for and seek and consume food. Now, ancestrally, the great majority of the population were starving. So if you didn't eat every calorie you came across, you were going to die. And so there's a massive selection pressure to eat a lot. Unfortunately, evolution is blind, and we've moved from an era in which calories were very sparse and difficult to come by to an era where, certainly in the West, to a large extent, there's a kind of continuous or semi-continuous food supply. So under those circumstances, we're slightly like fish out of water, and we're going to try and keep on eating every calorie we come across because that's what we were evolved to do. But we weren't evolved to cope with the number of and availability of food that we enjoy typically in the West. And so that's why a significant proportion of the population in the West are typically obese. I think in Britain, it's over a quarter of the population are obese. So it's an example of us being like fish out of water. We're adapted to live in an environment with very few calories, and now we're in an environment where there's lots of calories available, and we're suffering the consequences of that. So one example would be if you're dealing, as I was saying, with a client who might be struggling with their weight, to explain to them that it's not a personal failing. It's a normalizing feature for people to understand that there's an evolutionary origin to the way that they function. And it's normalizing, it says, you're not to blame. This is not your shortcoming. And so that's a good thing for people to feel. It's not a personal difficulty. It's kind of pretty much universal. And therefore people deserve compassion and understanding when they're struggling with these sorts of problems. So psychology is an academic and a clinical field, and it covers all the academic disciplines in psychology, as well as the applied clinical disciplines of psychotherapy. And psychobiology is, again, a subdivision of psychology, which looks at the evolutionary and the physiological mechanisms that underpin the way that we function. The benefit of psychobiology is to explain to people that they're not personally responsible for some of the psychological difficulties that they may be experiencing, that there are biological causes, and by helping a person to understand the nature of those biological causes, they can feel more at ease, more relaxed, because they're not constantly blaming themselves, not constantly beating themselves up so much for the difficulties they're experiencing. There are typically biological origins as well as social origins to the reasons that we are the way that we are. We're products of our genes and our environment, and I think we should take full personal responsibility in our lives to take charge of our destinies, but we're not to blame for much of the difficulties with which we're trying to grapple. If we're trying to help somebody lose social anxiety, which is very, very common, we can place it in an evolutionary context, in the sense that we can say, well, it's normal to be anxious in the presence of strangers, because, again, ancestrally, assaults were incredibly common. Now, thankfully, particularly in the West, they're very infrequent, relatively speaking. But we're kind of set up to be in an environment where people were constantly attacking each other. not constantly, but very frequently. And to help people understand that, that's not your fault. You were kind of designed biologically to possess that fear in order that you would be ready to deal with it. We're now in a new environment, and although physically, typically, not always, but typically it's very safe, but we're still armed with an anxiety or propensity to anxiety that it would be appropriate if it was indeed more dangerous. Social anxiety, particularly amongst young people, is very, very, very common. It's much more common in the wake of the lockdown. Why? Well, because people weren't exposed as much as previously to social interaction, and that will have given rise to a greater level of social anxiety. So placing these things in an evolutionary context typically is helpful to people.